Hello and welcome to this special episode of the CORDIScovery podcast. Today we're going to dive into some exciting innovations in health research that could transform the way we prevent, diagnose and treat disease. We'll learn about efforts to make injections needle-free, new diagnostic tools and therapies for heart conditions like arrhythmias and atrial fibrillation, how wearable technologies are being harnessed to detect life-threatening conditions such as sepsis, and the influence of urban environments on our health. I'm joined by representatives of 5 projects that have received funding from the EU's Horizon Europe programme, and these projects showcase how research can improve lives and reshape healthcare for the future. So a warm welcome to David Fernandez Rivas from the Bubblegum Project, Professor Stéphane Hatem, representing the project MAESTRIA, Dr. Bruno Miranda from the Emotional Cities Project, Dr. Andreu Clément, CEO of Corify Care, and Christoforos Pantelli from the project Sepsis Sensor. So, David, let me start with the Bubblegum Project. Your project aims to develop needle-free methods to inject liquids. What are the advantages in terms of patients' well-being, security, and waste reduction?
Right. Well, the main aspect in the environmental aspect that you are just mentioning, we use too many needles, and we are then on a quest to reduce the number of treatments that require a needle because we generate a lot of waste. The next important aspect of our technology is that it can be personalized because we inject tiny droplets in the very superficial layers of skin, and then we can do it in a very specific way that you receive only the doses that you require.
Okay. And how do patients feel about that?
Well, we haven't done yet a test with a living subject. We have done mostly laboratory tests. The hypothesis is that it's so superficial that you never touch the nervous system terminations that give the signal of pain. And it also happens so fast in such a small volume that you should not feel anything.
Okay. And can you describe to us in relatively simple terms, what is the science behind this innovation?
The science begins by using very affordable lasers now, diode lasers. Everybody now has it in their lamps at home. But a few years ago, it was still, emerging technology. So we use that as energy source to set liquid in motion by a phenomenon known as cavitation. So we make simply bubbles. That's why bubble gun. And then the liquid travels at velocities high enough that it can make its way in between the space of the cells in your skin.
And why is now the right time for this? Why hasn't this been possible before?
It's a combination of different factors. The environmental element became clear during the pandemics, the amount of waste that is generated with each injection, because you have to imagine it's also the plastic, the metal, manufacturing, sterilizing it, bringing it to the place of application. And afterwards, you cannot just simply throw it away. You need to process it properly. And it's a combination also of the knowledge we have at the University of Twente and my experience in microfluidics and the emergence of new technology like diode lasers that make this whole combination of factors into a portable device, which is now what we are working for the next steps.
Okay. Thanks very much, David. If I could turn to you, Stéphane, your project aims to develop new diagnostic tools and therapies for atrial fibrillation. How big a health problem is that in Europe today?
It's a very big health problem because atrial fibrillation first, its prevalence is increasing with the overall aging of the population, the lifestyles. We anticipate an epidemic of atrial fibrillation. And it's at the same time the first cause of stroke, cardiac cause of stroke and of heart failure. So it's a major health problem. And today the difficulty is to better identify patient at risk. Or when you have a first episode of AF, who's going to have a second episode of AF, how much you are exposed to the risk of stroke. And so there is a difficulty today to predict these two parameters. So we have created a digital tool which is accessible for clinicians. And this digital tool is using models that we have created using machine learning approach. And this model is using clinical parameters that you can obtain during routine practice, CT scan, echo, electrocardiogram. So the clinician, by connecting to this server, get access to this model and can obtain for his patient the prediction risk, such as what we call now the personalized medicine for a patient.
And how widely used is this digital platform right now?
Well, we are in the phase where we need to validate this platform, to make it popular, to make it knowledgeable. So we have developed a cohort of patients with a number of investigators throughout Europe, and we're going to validate with them the use of this platform before extending the use to a larger audience in Europe.
Okay. And how is the collaboration going with the different stakeholders in the project? So you have the clinicians, as you described, you have the patients, presumably you're working with industry as well. How does that work?
First, this consortium is follow-up previous European consortium from FPC, but we are in fact a sort of European community in this field of atrial fibrillation, atrial cardiomyopathy. So we have built up this consortium we use to work all together, and we have aggregate for MAESTRIA, new partners from the industry, from patients, but we have a sort of matrix which is there, which is our history, which makes things much more easy.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those points, I'm sure, in the discussion. But let me move to the Emotional Cities project. So Bruno, it aims to improve health through a better understanding of the interplay between people and urban spaces. That might sound a bit theoretical to some people. Can you explain in a bit more concrete terms what that means?
Yes, it's okay to think it's theoretical, but what this means is that we're bringing a new perspective into the field of urban planning and design by bringing methods and also new technologies from the field of neuroscience. And the idea is that when you think about the complexity of the city and how people experience it, you actually want to know from the perspective of the individual, what is the impact of all these exposures that city might have. And so we, of course, start with what we know about these two fields, but we moving forward in a way that we integrate these two pieces of information because we believe it's the way forward to change human behavior from the perspective of how environment influences the citizens, but also how citizens might change their behavior.
And which cities are you working in for the research?
So we selected 4 case study cities: Lisbon, Copenhagen, London, and Lansing in Michigan State of the United States. Because we selected these cities on the basis of their different layouts, on different properties from the demographics and urban design perspective. Of course, as well, taking into account that there were partners working with us on these cities.
Okay. And how have you been organizing the field work there?
So we worked from the perspective of the local community and trying to adjust some policy relevant and local relevant questions and challenges. So, for example, when we run real life experiments by conducting some city walks with wearable units, we selected these places on the basis of what the spatial analysis from urban analytics would tell us as informative, what type of hotspots are relevant. But we also try to sense what the local stakeholders actually were interested to know in terms of new evidence or new information that they could afford to have.
Okay. And how could city planners, for example, or local elected representatives take into account some of the insights from your research in order to improve people's health in an urban environment?
So I think from various perspectives, we still have the perspective of a more macro level or geographic information system level. So you could still use a lot of the data statistics that each country has from census and from surveys, but we could go deeper in terms of the knowledge about how we could combine this information at the level of the neighborhood, but going even further at the level of the street. So you could actually have very granular information about what's happening at the street level of your community. And so this could have an impact. And more importantly, it's human-centered. So you actually will provide information that is much more accurate than correlations that we might be using for some challenges.
Thanks very much, Bruno. If I could turn to you now, Andreu, SAVECORE is an acronym, the title of your project. It actually stands for something quite complicated, the stratification of atrial and ventricular arrhythmias based on electrocardiographic imaging. Can you explain a little bit what that means?
Sure. So first, thank you very much. And it is a great opportunity to have the chance to talk after Stéphane, because as he mentioned, cardiac arrhythmias is an epidemic. As he is pointing, one of the main issues that we have in Europe is that almost 10 million patients are suffering cardiac arrhythmia. Every single day, we are performing around 1,000 cardiac interventions to treat this kind of arrhythmias. And it's great because we have at least this kind of interventions. But the worst is that we only succeed in 50% of the patients. We put patients in the cath lab, in the surgery room. We introduce catheters into the heart. And then we try to stop the arrhythmia by burning the region that has causing the arrhythmia. But we fail. And why we fail? Because we do not have the technology, we didn't have the technology to see where the arrhythmia was coming from. So at the end, we are empirically burning the same regions in every patient. I was an engineer, I was in the academy trying to, I was working in the hospitals trying to help the clinicians to see what's going on. And we thought, what if we could map the heart globally, non-invasively, in a safe and efficient way? And that was the origin of Corify. This is a company that's a startup brought thanks to AT Health, the support of the European Union.
Yes.
And 6 years ago, we jumped from the idea, this is a prototype into a product. And right now, we already are in the market. We already have CE mark. We are in three countries around Europe. More than 1,000 patients per year mapped with our technology, and growing. Because at the end, this is the thing. We need to identify the arrhythmias, but we need to be sure that we can offer the best treatment to every single patient.
And perhaps, a similar question to the one I asked a moment ago. Why does the technology now allow you to do that in a way that wasn't possible in the past?
It's a great technology. Great question. So, in fact, this technology, we developed it originally in really basic research. It's scanning the thorax of the patient and reconstruct the electrical activity from a 3D reconstruction and generating digital twins. 10 years ago, it took us something like 1 week from the recordings to get a digital twin. Right now, it's a matter of seconds, thanks to the many
for
things.
Individual digital twin.
For an individual digital twin.
Okay.
So right now it's a matter of real time, bit to bit. And it's thanks to first better algorithms, which are unique. Artificial intelligence is helping a lot, but also the computing capacities. Right now we have some computer capacities within the hospital in real time. That is something difficult to dream just a few years ago.
Yeah. And presumably this is less invasive for patients as well.
At the end, the technology right now, we are using it within the hospital during the interventions because it's what we really want to be sure that it works, but it's fully non-invasive.
Yeah.
So we already are developing a simplified versions of the system to use it in any visit to the cardiologist or hopefully one day sooner than later in the emergency rooms to detect infarcts or in every checkup that you go to the cardiologist, and instead of an EKG, that is 100 years old technology, making a real digital twin of yourself that can show to the clinician how is your heart and how to prevent any potential arrhythmia that you may have in the future.
Okay, amazing. And last but not least, I turn to Christoforos from the Sepsis Sensor project. You're working on a wearable to be used by vulnerable people to assess biomarkers that could indicate sepsis. First of all, how dangerous is the condition and how many people in Europe are concerned potentially?
Sure. So let me first make a correction. It's not a wearable sensor.
Okay.
And the reason it's not a wearable sensor is because the definition of wearable sensors is something that we can wear in our everyday life, like a smartwatch, right?
Okay.
But the vision we had for this kind of devices for people in ICUs. And the reason for that is sepsis kills 11 million people every year.
Globally?
Sorry?
Is that a global figure?
Oh, yes. And if we do a calculation, it's about every 2.8 seconds someone dies from sepsis.
Yeah.
And so, it's a big problem. And we're trying to solve it via exhaled breath. And the reason for that is when sepsis is being detected is after the clinical symptoms appear. But that's already too late. And so we thought, could these signals, these biomarkers appear in breath while the sepsis is being developed before the clinical symptom? And the idea came the fact that the bacteria are growing inside the body, causing an infection. That infection spreads in the blood, in the organs, and obviously he's coming out of the breath.
Okay. And you clarified quite rightly that it's not a wearable in the sense of a smartwatch or something of that kind. But what can you describe what physically it looks like?
Exactly. So in a situation where someone is sitting in the ICU after a surgery or any other condition, the chances of developing sepsis are quite high. So we imagine like a mask on the face with the equipment on the side of the bed monitoring their exhaled gases. But towards our goal, we haven't done any clinical trials yet.
Okay. So
we are at the in vitro stage.
I see.
So there's in vitro on bacteria, then in vivo with mice, and finally human trials. But the in vitro tests were quite encouraging.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds very like it has huge potential.
Yes, we're able to detect the infection in bacterial cultures much faster than the current program. So we can detect infection in between 2 to 8 hours, depending on the amount of infection of bacteria. Whereas the current protocol, it takes overnight. So it takes 24 hours for a microbiologist to see the bacterial culture grown and be able to tell whether there's an infection or not.
Right.
Whereas with real-time and gas sensors, we can detect it much faster.
Okay. To what extent is artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, and so on enabling you to make progress in your different projects?
Well, I think that's something that we all have is skin.
Yeah.
And it's very personal, depending on how old you are, ethnicity, weather conditions. So in the follow-up project that we are now executing, Flowbeams is a spin-off company from part of the research that I did with my ERC grant. There we have a work package where we are co-developing AI tools that can help us understand how skin reacts before, during, and after a needle-free injection. And that is crucial because, when you are younger or are hydrated, your skin will react differently with the technology that we are developing. So we need it to make sure that we can have that personalized treatment that we are claiming.
Right. And Stéphane, for example, in your project, how significant is artificial intelligence?
The biomedical research in different fields is facing a huge challenge, which is the big data generated by omics, by clinical imaging. So AI is becoming an essential tool for research to manipulate this data, to analyze this data, to cluster this data. And there is, all the projects that we have conducting now has to have a data scientist or computer scientist on board to really bring together this expertise for new research on biomedicine. And the field of atrial fibrillation, cardiac arrhythmia, and diagnostic tools is, of course, totally in this new dimension of research, biomedical research.
And are there particular safeguards you have to put in place? Because, obviously this is quite sensitive personal and medical data that you're dealing with.
Yeah, so it's one difficulty of this type of research program. So now we get in this data sharing space in Europe, the Gaia X space, which facilitates a lot because it has delayed the beginning of the project to share data. So it's a major question, major issue in Europe, which is, I think, partially resolved now.
Andrea, may I ask you, because I have the impression you're quite far advanced in your project, what advice would you have for other colleagues around the table or others who might be listening to us if they want to bring their research breakthroughs to the next step in commercialization and application?
So it's true that we already are 40 people, almost 40 people in the company, and we are already in several countries. And the truth is that I come from the academy, from making papers and research, and of course applying for grants. But at the end is, what I clearly see is that if you are doing something that solves the need, solves the problem of someone, a clinician or a company, then there is a market for you. And you should understand the market as soon as you start to having the ideas in the research. You need to understand who is going to benefit from your research and who is going to pay for what you will produce thanks to your research. I think that should be mandatory that as soon as we are doing our PhDs, we should be trained in understanding these kind of questions.
And Bruno, maybe I think many of us live in cities ourselves. What can we do at a personal level to make sure we have the best experience and look after our health when we're moving around in the urban environment?
Well, from our perspective at the Emotional Cities, I believe is to actually be more critical about the current evidence that we have. So we have to push policymakers, politicians to go further in the data that we might provide. Because at the moment, even if we face a climate change issue, we actually tackling it by statistical correlations, by doing inference on the data, but we do not actually have evidence from the human perspective, what's the actual impact of going on my street and walking on my street. So I think that's the empowerment that the citizens will have to push for a more evidence-based driven policy making and decision making.
And perhaps the last word from Christoforos. You described your project as being at the in vitro stage. What do you think that it would take to bring it to the next level, and how do you see the project evolving over the coming years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. For the project to evolve better and come into life, we need a few more experiments to collect a bit more data. Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, we don't use AI yet. We have a completely different algorithm called change point detection that so far it's very robust and quick. And so we want to make that algorithm handle more data and ensure that we can detect the infection, but also the bacterium that caused the infection. That's the next stage for us. And after that, we're developing a prototype, a smart incubator that microbiologists and hospitals can use to speed up this detection of infection.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks to all of the guests for joining us, and to you for listening into this episode. You can follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and check out the podcast homepage on the Cordis website. Subscribe to make sure the hottest research in EU-funded science isn't passing you by, and you can find more information and project examples on the Cordis website, on the European Commission's Research and Innovation website, and in our online magazine Horizon.